Unlike reform initiatives in the Middle Ages, which were localized, religious reformation in the 16th century occurred literally on a European scale. Among the earliest venues for profound change within the Christian Church were the Swiss territories. The cities of Zurich and Basel especially led the way to Christian reform and renewal under the direction of dissenting priests like Ulrich Zwingli and Johannes Oecolampadius. Concerted efforts to secure unification with the German reformers ultimately failed due to an inability to agree on certain major doctrines. But that did not halt the program of reform already established in Switzerland. Magisterial reformation dominated religious change in the cities, though evidence to the contrary reveals popular initiative in some cases. War, violence, and religious strife convulsed the land. By 1531, both of the primary leaders of the Swiss reform were dead, one worn out, the other killed. But their legacies lived on, and any consideration of renewal within Christianity in the 16th century must come to terms particularly with Zwingli and the Swiss Reformation.
Speaking of the Swiss territories before the beginning of the Reformation there, as we consider the progress of religious reformation in the Swiss territories, it's very useful to bear in mind the unique makeup of the Swiss Confederation, as it was called. Today we would refer to it as Switzerland, but that's a bit of an anachronism, so I'll use the term Swiss territories. It was a unique makeup of social and political units. In fact, an unusually complex matrix. And the historical evolution of the Confederation gives us some very important clues which help to explain the course of the Reformation in Switzerland. Several points are at issue. First, Emperor Maximilian I tried to militarily subdue the Swiss. That really didn't work. The Peace of Basel, which was reached in the year 1499, ended the so-called Swabian War, and it recognized the Swiss as a nation, 1499. So you can put that into the chronology of Luther and the Swiss reformers that I'll be speaking of, and we're really 20 years out on that. And this was a successful conclusion to the struggle between the Swiss and the Habsburgs, which was one of the powerful political dynasties in Europe at the time. During the 14th and the 15th centuries, the Confederation grew, and the rural territories and the cities that made up this area came together for defensive purposes against the Habsburgs. Now there's two faces to the Confederation. One is the rural leagues that were emphasizing the rule of the community to be free from that of feudal lords, the whole medieval social context. And the second face to the Swiss Confederation were the powerful urban oligarchies who were ever eager to extend control over the rural hinterlands. Now this is very important for understanding both the success and the failure of Reformation in the Swiss territories. From the year 1513 up until the French Revolution, there were 13 states that comprised the Swiss Confederation. The most important, arguably, was that of Zurich, but there were others: Unterwalden, Glarus, Lucerne, Schaffhausen, Freiburg, Bern, Basel, and a variety of others. Some of these were staunchly loyal to the traditional faith, to the medieval form of Christianity. So the imperial aspirations of Zurich as the most important state or canton in the Swiss Confederation would remain a common feature. And the other cantons lived in, shall we say, a state of constant fear that Zurich was really just using religion to try to enhance its own situation. The reactions of Zurich's neighbors to the Reformation under Zwingli, and I will be speaking about Zwingli in some detail in this lecture, were conditioned in part by the fear that beneath the religious overtures that Zwingli and Zorich were engaging in, there was really a social and a political agenda. This created some problems because there were those in the other Swiss states that really didn't want to engage in Reformation for fear that all it was doing was helping to build up Zorich itself. That is, religion was simply a vehicle for politics. Hence, I think it's safe to say that a climate of suspicion prevails in these Swiss territories. There's a couple of important factors to note here at the outset. One is the absence of a coherent political situation. A structure of politics that's unified is missing in the Swiss territories. Indeed, late medieval Switzerland, on the eve of Reformation, was divided into 6 dioceses. These would be ecclesiastical provinces. These were Geneva. We'll be speaking about Geneva in a subsequent lecture. Basel, we'll talk about that in the second half of this present lecture. Lausanne, Constance, and 2 others, which we will not be dealing with. Now, Lausanne and Geneva were under the control of secular rulers. Constance and Basel were in serious ongoing conflicts with civil government. Okay, that's the first important factor. A lot of complicated politics going on. The second important factor is to underscore the fact that there is an equally complicated religious infrastructure in the Swiss territories. Some of the components of this. Lay piety was vibrant. That means common people were religious. They were pious, and their piety was vibrant. There was also a keen commitment to learning. And this commitment to learning may be measured in part with respect to humanism, which can be evidenced at the University of Basel particularly, which had been founded in 1459. There were numerous active printers and printing presses in the city of Basel. Indeed, Erasmus of Rotterdam is living in Basel during the early years of Reformation. Luther's 95 Theses caused waves in the Swiss territories. The Edict of Worms, remember April 1521, outlawing Luther, arrived to the attention of the authorities in the Swiss territories. But the Swiss rulers declined to accept the Edict of Worms. But on the other hand, they also avoided openly supporting Martin Luther. Dare I say, here we see an early instance of the famed Swiss neutrality. Let's just not take sides. We're not going to condemn Luther. We're not going to support him. We're Swiss. We're just in the middle here. The city councils in the Swiss territories were, in a sense, hostile to the Reformation. Now, I digress to remind you of a previous lecture on the German Reformation, in which I spoke of magisterial reform, where the reformers and city councils worked in tandem to promote religious reformation. If the city councils are adverse to change, it was very difficult to have reformation in that magisterial sense. So the implementation of reform in those areas was slow, was difficult, and in some cases it was completely impossible. But in Zorich, this was not the case. And her story of Reformation is somewhat different than some of these other cantons in the Swiss territories. The central Diet, the council, had very little power over the individual cantons, these 13 states that made up the Swiss Confederation. And when the Catholic estates attempted to bar Reformed cantons from the Diet from coming to the council on the grounds of heresy, this failed and failed completely because other cantons insisted that the alliance politically was legal and political and social, not based upon religion. And here we begin to see a little glimpse of that separation of church and state, which will come to characterize Reformation Europe in its later dimensions. It's also fair to note that the Catholic strength is to be noted, particularly in the rural Swiss cantons. Remember that fear of the hegemony of Zurich that I referred to a moment ago, made for a weak reception, if at all, in those particular areas. Reformation debates which emerged demonstrated that the Catholic forces were increasingly coming together in alliances to oppose the Reformers and the Reformation. The perception remains: Zurich is the enemy, Zwingli is a heretic, and that will impede the progress of Reformation. War did break out in 1529, but it didn't evolve into protracted civil war. The result, however, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but just to make this one point, the result was a virtual guarantee that the Reformation would not and could not succeed in the entire Swiss Confederation, as Zwingli obviously had hoped. Now, with these few points as background, we can now turn our attention to the main player in the early Reformation in Switzerland, which is in fact Ulrich Zwingli. Zwingli is a contemporary of Luther. He was born the year after Luther in 1484, and he died prematurely, as we will see, in 1531. Now, the Swiss Reformation, I want to be very clear on this point, is occurring simultaneously with Luther and what's going on in Germany. We must not labor under the misapprehension that Zwingli and the Swiss are simply following Luther. I would argue Luther is the father of the Reformation, but the father had many brothers, as it were, and they were simultaneously working for religious reform. Zwingli is one of them. Like the religious changes in the German lands, the Swiss initiative must be seen more or less as another example of magisterial reformation. Now, the Swiss Confederation is more or less the same now, geographically, as it was 500 years ago. Districts, and I've referred to them as cantons, and that's the proper term, formed the country. Now, Zwingli functions in the city of Zurich as a preacher, as an exegetical teacher, that is to say, he's interpreting the Bible, he's teaching the faithful, he's a theological author. He writes books, pamphlets on different aspects of theology. He's a church leader, as we will see, the preeminent leader of reform in those early days. And beyond that, like Luther himself, and John Calvin later, and Thomas Cranmer later, he's a political consultant. So here's a man wearing a number of hats in Zurich. He pastored previous to that in Glarus, a small town, for some 10 years, between 1506 and 1516. As time goes by, Zwingli owes more to Erasmus than anyone else. Now, when he began to come to the fore at Zurich, there were accusations about his morality. There was a rumor that Zwingli had seduced a young girl. He did sleep with her, by his own admission. What was his defense? He said rather coyly, the girl was a virgin during the day and a woman at night. She seduced me, Zwingli says. Well, that aside, we must acknowledge the warts as well as the accomplishments of some of these people. He comes to be engaged in reform activities. He interrupted a mendicant monk, a mendicant friar, on one occasion when the man was preaching by interjecting and saying, "No, you've got it wrong. You're misinterpreting Scripture." So he wasn't adverse to taking a proactive and a reactive position in terms of reform. He secretly married a woman by the name of Anna Reinhardt in 1522, though he kept this a secret for 2 years, until 1524. So he is to be numbered among the earliest of the reformers to marry. This was a big deal for clerics to marry in 16th century Europe. He demanded the abolition of the mendicant orders, Franciscans, Dominicans, these friars that went round begging, which is what mendicant means in the Latin, mendicare, to beg. Let's get rid of these people. They serve no good purpose. He advocated support for the poor. Now, there were major debates in the Swiss territories with the Catholics, and Zwingli plays a leading role in some of these debates. The reform in Zurich is carried out on 2 fronts. One against the Church of Rome, and the other front is against the so-called Anabaptists, who we'll be looking at in some detail in a subsequent lecture. There was a definite Puritan, if I may use that term, Puritan element to the early Swiss Reformation. Paintings and statues were removed from churches. And this might be regarded as somewhat of an oddity, inasmuch as Zwingli himself had been greatly influenced by Erasmus and was therefore a humanist in a way that Luther was not, and Luther never did get rid of the paintings and the pictures and the candles. Zwingli attacked abuses. He attacked the papacy, and like Martin Luther and other reformers, deplored indulgences and the practices associated with them. How influential was Zwingli? Well, I would point out that by the 13th day of April, 1525, the Mass was abolished, officially and formally, in the city of Zurich. Completely abolished. Well, Zwingli protested against the views of state authority that the Anabaptists held. Essentially that the 2 powers, the 2 swords, the power of the church, the spiritual power, and secular power should be separate. Zwingli said, no, 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 you Anabaptists have got it all wrong. There's no need to separate the powers instituted by God, be they secular or spiritual. On the 7th of March, 1526, a decree was passed against the theology and against the practices of the recalcitrant radicals, these so-called Anabaptists. And I'd like to read part of that decree to you because Zwingli's role is important, and it does help to set the stage for our discussion of these radicals later. The burgomaster, that's another term for the mayor. The burgomaster, council, and great council have long, and with the utmost seriousness, endeavored to convince the deceived and erring Anabaptists of the error of their ways. But yet some continued obstinately defiant of their own oaths, vows, and promises, and demonstrated their disobedience to the prejudice of the common law and the government, and to the disturbance of the public welfare and right in Christian conduct. Hence, some of them, men, women, and girls, suffered harsh punishment by our lords. It is now the earnest prayer, promise, and warning from our said lords that henceforth in this city, we are speaking of Zurich, in this city, territory and neighborhood, no man, no woman, or maiden shall rebaptize another, and anyone who shall do so after proper judgment shall without appeal be put to death by drowning. Therefore, everyone should take care not to bring about his or her own end in this way. You want to be baptized? By immersion? We'll baptize you by immersion in Lake Zurich, and we'll hold you down for some time. And that's how the Anabaptists were executed, with Zwingli's consent, I have to tell you, in Zurich. Now, there was opposition to the Reformation in Zurich. As I have mentioned, opposition to Zwingli and to the ideas that he promoted and set forth. There were plots against Zwingli. We know of a planned kidnapping. Let's put Zwingli on a slow boat to China. That's what they're going to do, is put him on a ship somewhere that was going somewhere else. There's another case that we know of, wherein a man wandered around the streets of Zurich with a sword, just hoping to run into Zwingli, and the pun is intended. The reformer's house was stoned one night. A gang of people gathered and they threw stones at the building, and his windows were smashed out. So even though reform is progressing in Zurich, it's not without opposition. And that opposition reached a pitch in 1526 when Zwingli was burnt in effigy at Lucerne. Not in person, not actually, but they burned an effigy of him. And that's a pretty powerful political statement, whether it's the 16th or the 21st century. The Baden Disputation was considered a sort of Swiss Diet of Worms. And despite the promise of imperial safe conduct, Zwingli did not go to Baden as Luther went to Worms. He declined to go, fearing perhaps that he might not fare quite as well as Luther had. Zurich was humiliated by the treaty that followed the war that will break out in 1529, and was determined to crush the Catholics. And this is the basis of this civil war, this war of religion that breaks forth. And its hand, Zurich's hand, was forced by the imposition of an economic blockade. So in 1529, a Christian civic union was formed, which included the city of Zurich, city of Basel, Bern, St. Gall, Biel, Strasbourg, Mulhausen, Schaffhausen, and Constance. We've got a number of cities, some of them very important cities, that have come together forming an alliance. Zwingli's role in religious reform in the Swiss territories, however, came to a premature end when he was killed on the 11th day of October 1531 during the Battle of Kappel. A soldier, upon finding Zwingli's body after the battle on the 11th of October, is reported to have said he was a heretic, but a darn good Swiss. His allegiance to the Swiss identity was never questioned, even by his Catholic opponents, but his theology, which we'll turn to in a moment, certainly came under question. When word of Zwingli's demise reached Martin Luther in Wittenberg, Luther is reported to have explained, well, he got what he deserved. Any man of God, any priest who would be caught dead, sword in hand, out there actively fighting, and gets killed, gets what he deserves. Now, Luther, of course, was most outspoken. Luther never pulled any punches. He said just exactly what he thought, and he had no regard for Zwingli on this point. Remember that Luther and Zwingli had faced each other across the table at Marburg 2 years earlier, and they couldn't agree on the sacrament of the altar. Now, there were several important results to this Battle of Kappel in terms of the Reformation. The Protestants were forced now to sue for peace. They lost to the Catholics, and so they had to enter into negotiations to preserve the advances that they had made. Each state in the Swiss Confederation was to decide upon its own confession. Now, this might be seen as comparable to the Peace of Augsburg, 1555, which I spoke of in a previous lecture, wherein each territory would get to define the nature of its religious faith and practice. Attempts at forcing religious reform or proselytizing was strictly forbidden. There'd be none of this business of trying to missionize and get Catholics to become Protestants or Protestants to become Catholics. That's outlawed. Evangelical states were forbidden from pursuing and promoting evangelical pastors in Catholic territories. The Union of the Reformed Towns, which I mentioned, is now abolished, and all ties to Germans and the German lands are severed. I don't think I have to say more to underscore that Zurich was shattered by this defeat. Kappel marked the end of Reformation expansion in the German-Swiss territories. Now, Zwingli has often been overshadowed by his more prominent contemporaries, Martin Luther and later John Calvin, who is yet to emerge into prominence. However, before moving away from Zwingli to some other aspects of Reformation in the Swiss territories, I think it's only fair to draw attention to some aspects of his theology and thought, which are in fact important. I won't speak in detail to these points, but a number of them should be mentioned to give Zwingli the recognition that he does deserve. He said that reality is both of the earth and of God, and it shouldn't be mixed. People have a moral responsibility, he taught, to become more spiritual, a moral responsibility. He taught a doctrine that comes close to sola scriptura, Scripture alone, but I would add with the usual nuances. He attacked the claim that tithes were a divine institution. That didn't win him too many friends among some of his colleagues. He doubted a literal hell. I really think that hell was literal. Unbaptized children are not damned. This was a theological question. What about children who have never been baptized and they die? Do they go to hell? Are they saved? Zwingli said unbaptized children are in no fear of going to hell. He attacked the Mass. He taught that salvation was definitely through Christ and works did not avail. Works do not aid one in becoming saved. It's the grace of God that is important. Importantly, he banned the use of music and singing in the liturgy in church services. And he dismantled the organ in the Zurich Minster, the cathedral. And I point out Zwingli was an accomplished musician himself, and yet he saw no place for music in church. He rejected the sacraments as a means of salvation, which means that really they're not sacraments at all, but rather symbols or ordinances of the church. He rejected, as we know, Luther's interpretation of the real presence in communion. This was clear at Marburg in 1529. He denied the freedom of the will. He sounds like he sides now with Luther against Erasmus. And what is the Word of God? For Zwingli, it is the act of God. There's no real knowledge of God apart from Jesus Christ. He taught a doctrine of election, as Calvin would, but election for Zwingli was tied to faith and has meaning for Christians only, not for non-Christians. The church is wherever Christ is and where the Word of God is recognized and proclaimed. For Zwingli, the Eucharist was literally a thanksgiving. Christ's presence is synonymous with faith, and he might have felt comfortable with St. Augustine, who once remarked, "Believe, and you have eaten already." People must submit to government, Zwingli taught, even if the government is wicked. Now this doesn't mean, however, to the extent of disobeying God. And he published pamphlets on these and many other matters. For Zwingli, the goal of society was not preoccupation with eternal salvation, but rather with the continuous self-renewal and service on earth. The magistrates were, of course, interested in this approach to religious reform and religious renewal, and hence the Zurich authorities were prepared to support Zwingli in his program. Well, Reformation in the Swiss territories cannot be restricted to Zwingli or to Zurich. Let us turn to the West. The timing was right in the western Swiss city of Basel for reform. Erasmus had fallen silent. Zwingli's voice was beginning to be heard across the Swiss cantons. Emperor Charles V was fuming over that crass and obstinate German monk. At Ingolstadt, Johannes Eck was raging furiously. Luther had reappeared in 1522, back from the dead, as it were, and the papal see, in the midst of transition, held its breath, waiting to see what the Holy Father, Pope Hadrian VI, would do. And at this very moment, these things, these currents of change and thought that are taking place, a man emerged in the city of Basel, prepared to give leadership to the fledgling reform movement there. He is among the leading first-generation Reformation personalities, and his name is a difficult one. It's Johannes Oecolampadius. Oecolampadius was older than Zwingli by 2 years, born in 1482, died the same year as Zwingli, though, 1531. He is the leading reformer at Basel. He's a leading philologist, an expert in languages, and he had a sound education at places like the universities of Bologna, Heidelberg, and Tübingen. He was recommended by the Hebrew scholar Johannes Reuchlin, along with Philip Melanchthon, to join the faculty at the University of Wittenberg. And it's interesting to speculate. Had Oecolampadius gone to Wittenberg and come under the influence of Martin Luther, how that might have changed the situation in Basel and in the Swiss lands. But he did not go to Wittenberg. Oecolampadius assisted Erasmus on both editions of the latter's Greek New Testament, but he was influenced by Luther while pastoring a church in Augsburg. Now, Basel had joined the Swiss Confederation as long ago as 1501, and democratic reforms in Basel paved the way for a reception of Reformation. And it's Oecolampadius who was a leading person at debates in the later 1520s, including that at Marburg, the Marburg Colloquy in 1529. A couple of opinions now on this man that many of you have never heard of, but who played an essential role in religious reform in the 16th century. Cardinal Aleander, the papal legate, wrote, "Johannes Oecolampadius, a monk learned in 3 languages and the outstanding scholar in the world of German scholarship, has written a large book on confession. In this book, he wants to abolish confession entirely. If I'm not wrong about this," Aleander wrote, "I believe he's worse than Martin Luther." Martin Luther lauded him originally. He said, "Erasmus has led us out of Egypt, but he will die with Moses in the plains of Moab. Oecolampadius, you can lead us over into the promised land." Well, unlike Zwingli and many of the other magisterial reformers, Oecolampadius dealt kindly with the Anabaptists. His views on the Eucharist brought him condemnation, however, from a variety of quarters. And I digress to say that in the 1520s, communion, the Eucharist, was probably the most controversial and contentious doctrine, even amongst Protestants. Everybody had a view, and hardly anyone was agreed. Witness the colloquy of Marburg. University of Paris condemned Oecolampadius. Erasmus, his old friend, critiqued him on the grounds that his doctrine of communion was contrary to Holy Scripture and the official church. Luther, who once said, "You can lead us to the promised land," now dismissed Oecolampadius and his teaching as Schwärmerei. It's a German term meaning fanaticism. Ridiculous. This is outlandish. It's fanatical. Oecolampadius was warned to flee. The noose proverbially was about to tighten around his neck. His views on the Eucharist, I might add, would impact Reformed theology and would also, before it was all said and done, influence Thomas Cranmer in England. In March 1528, a woman by the name of Wilbrandus Rosenblatt entered the picture in Basel. Now, she had been previously married to a minor reformer who was at this point deceased, and would later, Lady Wilbrandus, be married to a total of 4 reformers in succession upon the death of the previous one. I can only imagine that she was particularly attracted to Protestant reformers because she married 4 of them. The humanist Boniface Amerbach commented on the marriage of Oecolampadius and Wilbrandus. A decrepit old man with trembling head and body, so emaciated and wasted that you might well call him a living corpse, has married an elegant and blooming girl of 20, more or less. Well, she was 20, and 26 rather, and Oecolampadius was 46. Again, the reformers marrying. Erasmus wrote, joking that Oecolampadius had recently married an attractive girl in order to crucify his flesh during the period of Lent. Erasmus joked that Reformation was really becoming a comedy because it always ended in a wedding. Less a tragedy and more a comedy. Well, the private lives of reformers aside, meanwhile, back to the progress of Reformation, we discover that thoroughgoing iconoclasm aided the implementation of religious reform in Basel. As noted previously, there were popular movements in places like Wittenberg, Zwickau, Zurich, and Waldstadt. A similar pattern follows in Basel under the leadership of Oecolampadius. Andreas Karlstadt and other radicals, notably Thomas Müntzer, had visited Basel. Their influence perhaps lingers, though we cannot say with any assurance that they were behind what happened in Basel, though I think it is safe to say they were not displeased with what did eventuate. Monstrances were destroyed. As early as 1525, a burgher had been put into prison for smashing windows in the cathedral in Basel. In 1526, we hear of another individual banned from the city for desecrating a crucifix. And in 1527, there were further isolated cases of iconoclasm. Now, put this all together. It suggests to me that we have a pressure cooker type climate. The heat is on. It's boiling. It's simmering. It's only a matter of time until the lid blows off of religious renewal in Basel. Now, the city council, they're always important. They wanted to implement a slow, deliberate alteration in religious practice. But the common people, they didn't really want to wait around. The common people wanted the change now, something dramatic, something decisive. The situation reaches a crisis point in 1528 when radicals threw images out of several churches in Basel, including Oecolampadius' own church. They were promptly arrested, but they were released when several hundred guildsmen demonstrated at City Hall, threatening to strike if the demonstrators were not released from incarceration. So the city council was forced into a meeting wherein they mandated that images in churches could be removed, but they were to remain in several designated locations for the sake of Catholics who lived and worshipped in the city of Basel. Well, the radicals weren't really satisfied with this compromise, and so at Christmas, more than 300 guildsmen demanded total abolition of the Mass. Now, this has already happened 4 years previously in Zurich. 12 of the 15 guilds in Basel supported the abolition of the Mass. Well, the Swiss Federation was called in to mediate. This would be, in a sense, the centralized government But recall, they don't really have a great deal of power, but we've got to have mediation because we're looking now at civil war almost in the streets of Basel. The mediation went like this. Mass will be sung at 3 locations only. And everybody agreed. All of the interested parties said, okay, fair enough. 3 churches for the Catholics and the rest of it goes. However, once the Swiss Confederation left town and things looked like it was going to simmer down, the Catholics apparently reneged and said, no, we want to have Mass sung at more than 3 locations. Well, that was the spark the tinderbox needed to explode in Basel. Religious revolt merged very quickly after this into political revolution. The Catholics fled, and I'll tell you why. More than 2,000 citizens of Basel rampaged through the streets of Basel, destroying religious art. They broke their way into the cathedral. The high altar was pulled down. Statues were pushed from their pedestals. Paintings were savagely hacked into ribbons. Lamps were smashed. Stained glass was broken out. Murals were defaced. The Catholics regarded the whole business as inspired by demons, and, well, they should, I suppose, given the way it unfolded. In the Klein Basel, the predominantly Roman Catholic sector of the city, the mob forced the Catholics to perform the acts of iconoclasm. You can imagine how difficult that would be for a conscientious and pious Catholic to be forced at sword point by a Protestant to smash an image of, say, the Virgin Mary. But that's what they did. Once their job was completed, this mob reported back to the city council to the effect, well, everything that you failed to do in 3 years, we've done in an hour. In the morning, the city of Basel awoke and looked out the collective windows of the town upon the broken idols. Torsos, heads, arms, legs in wood and stone, all heaped in piles in the streets. Shreds of painted canvas and fragments of stained glass, glittering decoration and heaps of rubble throughout the city. We are told it took 2 days to burn the debris. The Mass was abolished. Everyone was required, I stress the word required, to attend Reformed services. Boniface Amerbach again reported, tongue-in-cheek I'm sure, Oecolampadius is so hospitable he makes us come to his table. The next month the city council proclaimed the entrance of Basel into the Federation of Reformed Swiss cantons. And the very next day, things are really moving along, the first evangelical church service is held in the cathedral. Those supportive of these measures could be found among the parish priests, the reform-minded monks, guild members, tradespeople, and artisans. And if we look at the constituencies of the city that didn't go along with this at all, we find most of the representatives connected to the university, to the cathedral chapter, and those among the wealthy merchants. Erasmus, he was there. He was so disgusted, he was so upset, he was so absolutely appalled that he bought a one-way ticket on a boat down the Rhine and left town on the spot, as it were. Now, we've previously spoken about the Colloquy of Marburg, 1529. The failure at Marburg to unite the German and the Swiss reforms, and all of the main people I've been talking about tonight, Zwingli and Oecolampadius and Luther, were all at Marburg. Serious implications for the Swiss. The German cities were able to take refuge in the strong Lutheran element in German politics, but the Swiss had fewer options. The inability of the Germans and the Swiss to agree, and part of this I have to lay the blame at the feet of Martin Luther, though I don't criticize his view, but his attitude was less than helpful. this left the Swiss outside the sphere of German interests, and more isolated and more vulnerable. And as with most of Europe, the relations between church and state, or religious and secular authorities, remained an important issue. And the point is authority. The problem of authority was a perennial one in 16th century Europe, and it figures into virtually every single one of the forms of Reformation at this time in history. At Zurich, Zwingli had advocated a close relationship between the church and the state, a concord, if you will. The radicals were of the mind that the church and the state, while ordained of God, were really quite separate. Our man in Basel, Oecolampadius, tried to follow a middle way. He said that religious discipline should be regulated by the community consistory. That's a council predominantly religious in nature, and he says that is the body that should regulate religious behavior. Now this anticipates John Calvin, and when we look at Calvin in Geneva on another occasion, we will see this actual theory put into practice. Now this isn't a separation of church and state by any means, but it is a civil order administered by the church. It called, I suppose, for the city council to adopt a system of lay presbyters, if you will, to monitor morality. And the best example of this experiment will come in Calvin's Geneva, so I will not discuss here how it worked in Basel. Well, the city council, when presented with this proposal, said, no, that's not the direction we want to go. Now, for Oecolampadius, the two swords should not be fused absolutely, as they were in the minds and in the thoughts of some of the other reformers. He did not call, however, for the expulsion of magistrates from the church, as the radicals would, when the radicals said the bishops and the princes must not be occupying the same office. Magistrates have no business running church affairs. They have no business running religious issues. Oecolampadius did not go that far. He took the position instead that the prince had been entrusted with authority, but for a different task, civil authority, and rules, regulations, and law in that dimension. Well, on the first day of April, 1529, just a few months after the uprising in Basel, the city council released its Reformation Ordinance, as it's called. And this document regularized religious practices in the newly constituted city. So again, this is magisterial reformation working, the magistrates with the reformers. Now you know that in the fall of 1531, Zwingli was killed. When he was killed on October the 11th, during the Battle of Keppel, Johannes Oecolampadius was called to Zurich to succeed the slain Zwingli as the leader of reform and religious renewal there. But he declined the invitation and then up and died himself just a few weeks thereafter. So both prominent first-generation reformers in the Swiss territories died within weeks, within 6 weeks of each other. And this, of course, had serious consequences for the ongoing reform movements there. Several of the main emphases in the thought and program of Oecolampadius served to shed light, as Zwingli did, on the Swiss Reformation in its first generation in those territories. On the Eucharist, that contentious doctrine and practice of the Church, Zwingli, his influence certainly percolated into Oecolampadius, and I think it's fair to say that Oecolampadius remained Zwinglian in his view of the Eucharist, though it should be noted there were some notable departures. The church-state relations that I have spoken to somewhat in this lecture remain very important for Oecolampadius. And he promoted a concept of ethical regeneration, which I would suggest might mark part of the beginnings of Puritanism. And let us not lose sight of the fact that his influence in England was in fact quite substantial. Another important figure associated with the Reformation in the Swiss territories is that of Martin Bucer, who married the ever-available Wilbrandus once Oecolampadius died, but not before she married somebody else. He was another reformer. He was active as a reformer in the city of Strasbourg. And Bucer, like Zwingli and Luther and Oecolampadius, is to be numbered among the front ranks of reformers. Far too many people who've got superficial understandings of the Reformation tend to focus on Calvin and Luther and forget that there was a number of men, and there were even some women, who were very important and very influential. Bucer would be one of them. He was influenced by Luther as long ago as Heidelberg, 1518, when Luther went there to defend Augustinian theology. Bucer was a regular participant in the debates, in the colloquies. He was, of course, at Marburg, along with the rest of them. He stressed the absolute power of the Word of God. He advocated justification by faith and election. Luther would advocate justification sola fide, by faith alone. Bucer said by faith and election. That's a little nuance to keep in mind. Faith was a sign of election, he would say. If you've got faith, it's proof that you've been elected. He has been called with some justification the first modern ecumenical churchman. He felt that Zwingli and Luther on the Eucharist could have and should have been reconciled. But unlike some of the other reformers, he recognized the ambiguity and the deceptive nature of words. He maintained that Christ was not the antithesis of Moses, as Luther had quite clearly stated. Well, there are several other names associated with the early Swiss Reformation, which I will mention only in passing. Myconius, Oswald Myconius would be one. Wolfgang Capito, Wilbrandus married him after Oecolampadius and before Bucer. He was the fourth of the four reformers that she would marry and, I might add, outlive. William Farel, whom we will speak of in the Calvin lecture, who's linked importantly to Calvin and to Geneva. And finally, Heinrich Bullinger, who was the one who did succeed Zwingli at Zurich and who had a long, successful, and important career, not only in the Swiss territories, but influencing events in England as well. It remains then to note that the influence of humanism and its impact was greater in the Swiss territories than in the German lands. It's also noteworthy to point out that Erasmus did come back to Basel, and he died there in 1536. The Swiss Reformation did not provide the Swiss with the ideological ability to unite the loose collection of territories. Indeed, and unfortunately, the historic animosity and internal tensions that were latent within the Confederation militated against any possibility of successful reformation on a territorial scale. And by this I mean from a magisterial Reformation point of view. The Reformation was not successful in Switzerland on that level. But to what extent, and this is an important question, should religion be intertwined with state affairs? The radicals would have a different view altogether. On a positive note, the early Swiss Reformation produced the first Protestant order, wherein Protestants and Catholics could establish political and religious communities existing together. And I point out this predates the 1555 German Peace of Augsburg by more than 20 years. Zwingli, Oecolampadius, and many of the others would have regarded this as failure. They desired, they worked for much more. But be that as it may, it did secure Reformation in Switzerland. And men like Ulrich Zwingli and Johannes Oecolampadius are numbered and are to be numbered among the most important figures in Reformation and indeed in the history of the Church.